We've been outlining some of the key moves and conceptual influences in Lacan's early work in his doctoral dissertation. And we will now look a little bit at the key case history that takes up a fair amount of space in that doctoral dissertation, namely the famous account of Marguerite Anzieu, who we will refer to as Aimée, because that's also the name that Lacan gives her in his case. Interestingly enough, Aimée is also the name of one of Anzieu's characters, the main character of one of her novels. So it's a purposeful selection. So what we'll do is we'll just highlight a couple of moments, outline some details of the case, and offer some reflections on that. And we will cite Lacan directly. We'll also make pretty extensive reference to Olga Cox-Cameron's fantastic overview paper that I've already cited. It is a 2000 publication just entitled Lacan's Doctoral Thesis. So we'll make a lot of reference to that. We'll also highlight one or two quotes from Darren Leader's What is Madness? And as I mentioned already, we'll pick up some quotes from Lacan himself. Okay, so we are starting the case by highlighting the key event violent event that in many respects is what makes Aimée famous or notorious in some respects. And so what that night is, it's the 18th of April in 1931, and we find Aimée waiting outside a Paris theater where she accosts an actor, Huguette Duflos, who had been starring in a play called Everything is Going Well. And she tries to stab her. Aimée succeeds in severing some of the tendons in her hand. She is subsequently accosted. And when she is asked why she did this, she says, well, this actor, Duflos, had been attempting to plagiarize her. Let's see what Lacan has to say about this. He says, I'm quoting, on initial questioning, Aimée explained her behavior by saying that the actress had been instigating scandal against her. Okay, so a slight variety in the account. According to Aimée, this actor had been mocking and menacing her for a number of years. What else can we say? What other important details should we attend to? Well, we can go back to Lacan's account. Aimée, he says, was age 38 at the time of the incident. We know not only her age, but that she had been married but was now separated. She was living in Paris, but she had a kind of rural peasant background. And what also then came to light was that she had been previously a voluntary patient in another psychiatric hospital. And so let's just see, and she'd stayed in this other psychiatric hospital for around 6 months. And this is what Lacan notes about that. This is now 6 years before. 6 years before, she'd been a voluntary patient in this other psychiatric hospital. The following extracts from her case notes give some idea of her condition at the time. Lacan is now obviously quoting the case notes. Psychiatric disorder of 1 year's duration. People in the street made insulting remarks, accuse her of extraordinary vices. People around her say all sorts of evil things about her. The whole town of Melun knows about her behavior and regards her as depraved. So, end quote. So this is interesting. I mean, it sounds like in terms of what we were talking about earlier, in terms of paranoid knowledge, the world has become an inhospitable place, and there are multiple different phenomena that maybe someone else might interpret very differently, but are now being interpreted, you could say, ostensibly neutral phenomena or stimuli, whatever, are now being interpreted as fundamentally accusatory, as fundamentally plotting against and meaning ill intent to her, Aimée herself. One of the other things that comes up in the initial survey when she is accosted and arrested for attacking Duflos is that she is obsessed by the safety of her only son. And it sounds like the onset of paranoid symptoms can be linked to not just concerns with her son, but her first pregnancy. And now it turns out that Aimée had been pregnant earlier on. It's worth noting just a little footnote, a bizarre sort of historical note here, and that's to say that if Marguerite Anzieu, sorry for the mispronunciation, if that Anzieu name sounds familiar to students of the history of psychoanalysis, it's because subsequently Didier Anzieu would become an analyst, pretty much a strong opponent of Lacanian psychoanalysis in due course, but at one point had entered into analysis with Lacan himself. And the suggestion is that there was a time before either man knew the particular details of what they had in common, which of course would have been Marguerite Anzieu. Didier did not realize that Lacan had treated her, and Lacan didn't initially realize that Didier was her son. And there is speculation, certainly by Jean Lelouch, that it was around this time that Lacan is running around Paris trying to buy all the earlier printings of his doctoral dissertation, perhaps so that this piece of history doesn't come to light, and that Didier Anzieu would realize who he was. So just a little footnote, but back to the details of Aimée's case history. We now know that there was something at the time of the first pregnancy that seemed to have caused some disturbance. This is where paranoid symptoms first seem to come to the fore. In in Cox Cameron's paper, she suggests, having looked at a lot of evidence, that it was at around the time of the first pregnancy that something changed in the world around Aimée. And these initial paranoid assumptions, ideation, intensified after the stillbirth of her daughter. The child was born dead, strangled by an umbilical cord. And Cox Cameron notes that this really cruel turn of events was particularly cruel, you could say, given that what Aimée is already starting to struggle with is paranoid ideas. And then to find that her daughter is born in this way, or born dead, would only presumably have intensified this. Cox Cameron's remark is Aimée's delusional world begins to take shape at this point. If we go back to some of the case details and see how Lacan speaks about it, he says, her child was born dead. It was a girl asphyxiated by having the cord around its neck. She, Aimée, was devastated. She blamed it all on her enemies, and in particular on a woman who for 3 years had been her best friend. Okay, so once again, this seems suggestive that there is someone close to one, someone in some respect who is a friend, a stand-in, almost a mirror image, who now is blameworthy for something that has happened to you, some terrible event. Um, Okay, so it was around that time that Aimée was first hospitalized. She is first hospitalized, as we've seen, for 6 months. This is some time ago. Then we have the birth of her son. And it is during this second highly anxious pregnancy that seems to have triggered both her literary ambitions and her first major breakdown. So she plans to immigrate to America to become a famous novelist. Her general delusional behavior leads her family to have her interned in the private asylum. And that's when she is first put in an institution, what we've been discussing. And she stays there, as we've seen, for about 6 months. Then once she's released, she moves to Paris, where she becomes increasingly obsessed by the fear that her son's life is under threat, and that the threat emanates from the world of letters and the world of arts. And I'm quoting from Cox Cameron. She feels that she's being plagiarized. And to me, this is a fascinating detail. She feels that she's been plagiarized. Why do I say it's a fascinating detail? Well, if we go back to the notion of paranoid knowledge, there is an idea, as we've discussed previously, that at least certainly when we think about the imaginary register, that in Lacan's theorization of it, I, as a subject, am in many respects fundamentally reliant on the image that enables me to have some sense of an I. And you could say that that image that allows me to have a sense of an I, in as much as it comes from the outside and in as much as it's there before I have an I, is in some respects more authentic, more original than me. It comes first. And I suppose once you've got those two elements in place, you've got not only the transitivism of I is an other, but that this other is somehow a potential rival, that they were more me than me, that they're original. And with those two things in place, it kind of makes sense that the other would be blamed for certain kinds of things as a rival. And it also somewhat makes sense that you might have a delusion of plagiarism in this respect, precisely because you could say it's a reversal of the fact that me, myself, comes from someone else. In a sense, the ego is itself a plagiarist of an image that they take as a basis for themselves. And what we could be seeing here is a kind of reversal of that, an aggressive attacking of another who's accused of plagiarizing myself. Okay, so I'm going to pick up just a few quotes from how Lacan is talking about the case. And then we'll look at another interesting moment and in that is only mentioned very briefly in Lacan's dissertation. And then we will also offer a couple of summary notions from Cox Cameron's paper, just to hopefully to try to make some of these things a little bit more coherent. So one of the things that Lacan notes when Aimée is arrested after she attacks the actor, he says the following: by the time she was transferred to hospital, the conviction attached to her delusions had completely disappeared. She was well-oriented, had no intellectual impairment, showed no evidence of thought disorder, and her attention was unimpaired. When recalling the themes of her delusions, she felt ashamed and realized that they were ridiculous. However, her emotional response during initial interviews, particularly the detached manner in which she referred to the victims of her assaults, suggested a lack of sincerity. End of quote. So just to highlight two things, one of the things that is amazing about the case, and Lacan highlights it, and many people who retell it also do, is that there is a certain point at which, despite this fairly lengthy and developed history of paranoid ideation that we have discussed, after she has been imprisoned for a while, done her time in a way, so to speak, the delusions disappear, and she seems to be cured, almost as if having been punished, that she no longer has to labor beneath the weight of these delusions. They kind of almost completely vanish. In fact, maybe they do. So that's a fascinating point in the case. And of course, Lacan is then obliged to say why that is. But what he's saying here is he's already saying that after attacking her, they seem to be alleviated, the delusions. So there's something about why they go away, or what is involved in the act, or what is involved in the subsequent punishment that means that these delusions will dissipate. But what he's also saying here is that, well, okay, they seem to be ameliorated, they seem to go away, but maybe not quite so immediately. He goes on to say her delusions had lost their intellectual appeal, but some of them still evoked emotion. For example, she might say, I did that because someone wanted to kill my child. But the grammatical form in which she recounted the reasons for her behavior, her defiant manner, head held high, arms crossed, trembling and hushed voice, all of these suggested they still exercised a powerful influence over her. So, in other words, there was some apparent shifting in the nature of the delusions and the hold they had on her, but they were not gone yet. But isn't it interesting, even in the very early 1930s, Lacan is already referring to the grammatical form in which she recounted the reasons for her behavior. So just a few more notes on what Lacan made of what he calls the development and content of delusions at the time when she was suffering the most. Aimée's delusional state illustrated almost the entire range of paranoid themes, he says. There were delusions of persecution, expressed through ideas of jealousy and prejudice. There were delusions of grandeur, with dreams of escaping to a better life and notions of having a grand mission to accomplish. Eventually, she showed systematized erotomania attached to a royal personage. There were no hypochondriacal delusions, however, and no belief about being poisoned. So I suppose in a way, it's almost like he is thinking through or highlighting a whole range of different types of paranoid themes. And he seems to be quite right. There was a delusion of persecution. Duflos, the actor, was assumed to be persecuting her, to be spreading rumors, just as we've seen her sense that other people, in a somewhat irrational way, had done things to her that presumably they hadn't. So we have the delusions of persecution. We also see jealousy and prejudice. We'll give an example of that shortly. Also, delusions of grandeur, because one of the things that initially made her family somewhat concerned about her was that she had these seemingly unrealistic ambitions of going off to America and becoming a famous novelist. So we've got delusions of grandeur, escaping to a better life, and of having a grand mission to accomplish, this kind of literary mission that she was hoping to accomplish. She also, going back to the quote, showed systematized erotomania attached to a royal personage. So I haven't mentioned that yet, but one of the other things that comes to light when Lacan is spending many, many hours with Aimée, asking her questions or exploring many, many different facets of her life, is that she had started writing sonnets and writing to the Prince of Wales, and had indeed showed, to use the quote, a systematized erotomania towards the Prince of Wales of the time. We're also told in the case history that eventually all the writings that she had posted to the Prince of Wales were returned with a note saying, unfortunately, the Prince of Wales doesn't, as a matter of principle, accept gifts from people that he doesn't know. So it's interesting that there's a whole array of these different modes of paranoia that are apparent there.